Today we're doing a follow-up to How to Leave the Matrix for Real. If you haven't watched that one yet, go grab it. We broke down how high control systems act as closed-loop bomb shelters and force your nervous system to run biological dialysis for them. I grew up in church, and shortly after I posted the last video, a verse came out of nowhere into my mind. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. So I chose to deep dive Matthew 24, and then I clearly saw that I was being guided towards something very important to say. So today I want to talk to the past me, the version of me who sat in church pew after church pew hearing apocalyptic verses and feeling that low-grade, quiet terror of end times. For centuries, the institutional church has handed us a very specific script for that verse. It's actually really sci-fi when you think about it. A literal physical rapture where believers float into the sky while everyone else gets to burn in hell. But what if we strip away the church's paint on Jesus' words? Look at the historical and linguistic context of first century Judea and run it through the physics of consciousness. What we find is surprisingly revealing and surprisingly supportive of the exact same framework I built up in the last video. Let's look at the actual code. When Jesus stood looking at Herod's temple and famously said, "Not one stone will be left upon another," the disciples heard a literal 3D building crisis that would impact their physical way of life. And modern churches hear some version of end times depending on their flavor of denomination. But in first century idiom, destroying the temple was prophetic shorthand for the collapse of an institutional paradigm. The temple wasn't just a building, it was the central node of an extractive, high-control economic and religious loop. It required constant tribute, sacrifice, and human compliance to keep the elite in power. By the time 70 AD rolled around, that system was already choking on its own internal corruption and violent factioning. When the Roman legions finally land siege to Jerusalem, they didn't just destroy a building. They delivered the final fatal blow to a structurally bankrupt operating system that was already collapsing under the weight of its own entropy. When a closed loop hits maximum extraction and can no longer process its own waste, the structure has to fall. And the eerie irony? The very empire that swung the hammer, Rome itself, was running the exact same extractive loop. The Roman Empire ran on maximum extraction, heavy taxation, expanding military bureaucracy, internal corruption, and relying on externalized energy, conquest, slavery, tributary states, to keep its closed loop breathing. Centuries after it destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, the empire itself choked on the exact same entropy and collapsed from the inside out for the exact same reasons. These patterns have a way of repeating themselves. The beast system always consumes itself in the end. Then there's the warning about people coming in his name. The verse says, "For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars." So, you may already know this, but I had to teach myself this. The church treats the word Messiah as God come down to earth. But Judaism, which is what Jesus practiced, uses the word to mean a human ruler who brings peace on earth. When the text points to wars alongside false claims, that's just history in a nutshell. We humans seem to keep buying the lie that we need war to make peace. Think about how history and modern institutions define peace. To an empire, peace doesn't mean harmony or sovereignty. It means having the largest army around so they can't lose a war. Every geopolitical ruler who promises safety through control is running the exact same ancient script. Jesus was warning his listeners, don't look for an external king to save you, because the external authority's version of peace is just another cage. And when we look specifically at the term, "in my name," to peel back more paint, this is what we find. In the Greek, epe to onomatimou translates into something that aligns remarkably well with a unity consciousness framework. In the Ancient Near East, a name, onoma, didn't just mean a label you get called by your friends and loved ones. It meant your nature, character, authority, and operating frequency. To act or speak in someone's name meant you were literally plugging into their structural authority and running their exact code. In the Greco-Roman world, an official messenger or courier did not travel or speak in their own authority. When a king sent a courier, that courier carried a signet ring, a royal seal, or an explicit mandate. When they arrived at their destination and spoke in the name, ento onomati, of the king, they were functioning as an extension of the king's legal and structural presence. They were running the sender's code. So what does that mean when we apply it to the framework? An authentic courier is someone who actually plugs into the real source, delivers the unedited message of liberation, and leaves the listener's sovereignty completely intact. They don't ask you to worship them. They point straight back to the frequency of the sender. A counterfeit courier is the one Jesus was warning us about. They show up wearing the royal uniform, holding a forged or expired telegram, claiming to speak for the king, but their real goal is to get you to lock yourself inside a controlled compound and pay taxes to them. When Jesus warned that many will come in my name, saying, I am the way, the church taught us to look out for a cinematic antichrist, a dark satanic villain trying to trick people away from the faith. But in the ancient world, a name meant an operating frequency, a structural authority, a code. He was actually talking about the ultimate counterfeit, systems and leaders that hijack the vocabulary of salvation, healing, and higher truth, whether packaged as religious holiness or secular enlightenment, and use it to drag you right back into a closed, extractive loop. They speak the language of freedom but demand your submission. They use the high-frequency branding of truth to rebuild the bomb shelter. It's the ultimate wolves in sheep's clothing warning. Systems and leaders that appropriate the language of liberation to rebuild a cage. Let's look at the coming on the cloud section more deeply, because that is where we usually get the most tangled up in rapture concepts. In modern Western thinking, clouds mean fluffy white things in the sky you float up to. But in the ancient Near East and Hebrew biblical idiom, clouds are smoke, fire, and political overthrow. It was standard apocalyptic shorthand for divine judgment and the downfall of an empire. For example, in Isaiah 19, it says God rides on a swift cloud to judge Egypt, which historically meant Egypt getting conquered by Assyria, not God flying physically over the Nile. When Jesus uses the term Son of Man, he is directly referencing Daniel 7. In Daniel, the Son of Man doesn't mean a divine being descending down to earth. It represents the oppressed human collective taking over the rule of the earth. Contrast that with beasts in Daniel 7, which represent brutal, extractive empires like Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome that devour people and run on blood and taxes. So when the Son of Man comes on the clouds in those verses, it is a poetic way of saying the era of the beast empires is over and human sovereignty under God is arriving. So now, what about all the peoples of the earth will mourn? In English translations, it sounds like everyone on the globe is crying because Jesus is showing up. But the Greek word translated as earth or land is gay. In the first century Judean context, it almost always meant the land, specifically the local region of Judea and Jerusalem. When the Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem in 70 AD, bringing absolute devastation, fire, and smoke, aka clouds, and the total collapse of the temple state, the people of the land mourned their entire world, as it was literally burning down around them. And what about the phrase, "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven"? In ancient imperial Rome, the sign of a victorious conqueror or reigning emperor was displayed across the sky through military might, banners, and smoke. Jesus is essentially using their own political language to say, you are looking to Rome for power and safety, but the real sign is that the old beast system has lost its grip and isn't going to be another empire marching in. It's going to be the undeniable sweeping collapse of this corrupt temple economy. To a first century audience steeped in Hebrew prophecy, coming on the clouds was standard poetic code for the collapse of a corrupt empire. The clouds were the smoke of a falling system. The mourning was the grief of a local population watching their entire geopolitical and religious bomb shelter burn to the ground. It was the absolute end of the old extraction loop. Which brings us right to the field and the hand mill. 2 men will be in the field, 1 taken, 1 left. 2 women grinding at the mill, 1 taken, 1 left. This is where we look at the mundane, hyper-local reality of these verses. Imagine the scene. 2 people standing side by side doing the exact same mundane 3D labor in the ancient dust. On the outside, their lives look identical. But when a systemic collapse hits, when an old paradigm dies, human behavior always splits down 2 distinct responses. The default loop. People who double down on the system, panic, look to external authorities for safety, and run the old entropic endurance scripts because the terror of the unknown is too high. The sovereign shift. People who quietly stop feeding the loop, turn inward, anchor a new baseline, and step out of the machinery. So we can see in the field and mill imagery the idea that one person's awareness remains trapped inside the entropic loop, panicking, looking to external authorities to save them, and running the old endurance scripts. The other person has quietly stopped feeding the ghost loop. They've found the kingdom within, stabilized their nervous system, and shifted frequencies. On a structural level, their realities diverge so sharply that they end up inhabiting entirely different worlds. One is taken into a high sovereignty, self-generative timeline of peaceful flow. The other is left behind in the collapsing box full of panic. No clouds required. It's a pure architectural frequency split. And what about that line? If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. The church taught us that the elect meant a VIP club of religious insiders getting a free pass out of planetary suffering. But eklektos simply means the ones who choose differently, the ones who wake up. If humanity runs the extractive, parasitic loop to its absolute logical extreme, that ends in self-termination. But for the sake of the ones who choose differently, the people who anchor a new baseline of awareness, who refuse to act as biological dialysis machines and decide to step out of the bomb shelter, the self-destruction cycle gets hacked. The collapse gets interrupted because a critical mass of human wetware, our actual biological hardware running the code of consciousness, choose a higher operating system. In fact, if we pull from another teaching just a few chapters away, Jesus explicitly told us how this works. He said, "The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough." We've been trained by empire mentality to think that changing the world requires a massive army, a political movement, or a loud revolution. But ancient yeast wasn't a packet of active dry granules from the grocery store. It was a living, fermented starter left over from the previous batch, a microscopic high-frequency code dropped quietly into dead flour. You don't need to conquer the system or build a bigger bomb shelter. You just have to hold your frequency. A tiny cluster of untrapped human wetware acting as living yeast changes the chemical makeup of the whole batch from the inside out. The collapse gets interrupted. The loop gets broken. You don't have to wait for the sky to split open to escape the matrix. You don't have to wait for permission from an institution that treats your sovereignty as a biohazard. Ancient masters and prophets weren't giving us a manual for a cosmic escape hatch. They were giving us a diagnostic code on how to survive the collapse of an old operating system without losing our minds or our humanity. Stop feeding the ghost loops. Drop the requirement of silent endurance. Look at the patterns. Read the code and realize you don't need to fix the bomb shelter from the inside. You just have to walk outside of it and look to the kingdom within you.